Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping into a really powerful sermon from Apostle Promise Adeyemi called The Man God Made. We're going to break down the core ideas about who we originally designed to be, what our purpose is, and where our story is ultimately headed. All right, let's get into it.
So everything in this message really hinges on this one big question. It's something we all think about, right? Who were you really designed to be before life and circumstances and other people tried to give you a different label? The first major idea the sermon presents is what it calls the divine blueprint. And it starts with a pretty bold claim that you and I, humanity, were the only part of creation that was designed, defined, and given a destiny before we were ever physically made.
This quote right here is the heart of that whole blueprint idea. You got to notice the sequence: design first, then definition, then destiny. And only after all of that was sorted did the forming happen. The sermon says this specific order is exactly what makes us so unique.
And to really drive that point home, look at the difference here. For everything else, like light, it was a command. Let there be. Simple. But for us, the language totally shifts. It becomes a conversation. Let us make. The sermon describes this as a divine boardroom meeting of the Trinity. Not just a command, but this incredibly intentional, collaborative creation.
So, what does it even mean to be made in God's image? Well, the message is really clear that this has nothing to do with how we look physically. Nope. It's about being stamped with the very nature, the character, and the glory of God Himself. The original blueprint included His power, His authority, and His identity right from the start.
Even the physical stuff we're made of is symbolic. On one hand, we're formed from dust, which represents humility, our connection to the earth. But then we're brought to life by the very breath of God, which is all about divine empowerment. It's that mashup, that fusion of the humble and the holy that defines us.
And this quote just nails it, doesn't it? It sums up that fusion perfectly. The dust by itself is, well, it's just a container. It's the divine breath, that spirit, that ignites the whole thing and turns a simple form into a being with purpose and destiny.
Okay, so we're formed, we're empowered. Now what? What are we supposed to do? The sermon lays out what it calls a five-fold divine mandate. You can think of it as the original job description for the man God made.
And that job description has 5 key parts. First, be fruitful. In other words, produce results. Second, multiply. Grow your impact. Third, fill the earth, which means to occupy spaces and have influence. Fourth, subdue. Take chaotic situations and bring them into divine order. And finally, have dominion, which is all about ruling in a way that reflects God's heart and principles. Now that multiply step is directly tied to this idea of influence. And this is so crucial. The point is, you can't have an impact if you don't have influence. The sermon frames it as the currency of purpose. It's what makes people listen when you have something to say. So, if that was the original plan, if that's how it was all supposed to work, what happened? This is where the story takes a turn. This section is all about the fall and how humanity got disconnected from that original state of glory. And the difference between the before and after is just stark. It's night and day. The original man had dominion, walked in open fellowship with God, and had this incredible boldness. But after what the sermon calls a single, careless conversation, that whole identity got flipped upside down. Dominion was replaced with fear, fellowship turned into hiding, and that open access to God was just gone.
This quote really captures the true loss. The sermon argues the fall wasn't just about losing a garden. It was about being stripped of glory. An extraordinary being designed for so much more became ordinary. He was unplugged from the very source of his power.
But here's the good news. The story does not end there. In fact, the most powerful part of the sermon is about the path back. It's about the theological heart of the message, which is this idea of restoration.
This verse right here is the engine for that whole restoration. And the key phrase is new creature. The idea isn't to just fix the old broken version of you, it's to become someone, something entirely new.
And this is such a critical point. Salvation, in this view, is not a refurbished life. It's not a patch-up job,
We're not talking about a spiritual fixer-upper. It's a recreated life, a total reboot back to the original divine blueprint.
So this brings us to the grand finale of the sermon's narrative. What is the ultimate destiny for this restored, recreated person? This is where everything comes full circle.
The path to that final destiny is laid out in 4 steps, all coming from Romans chapter 8. And it starts with this huge, powerful idea, predestination. In this context, it means the end of your story. The victory was already locked in by God before you ever took your first step.
So after being predestined, that person is called. The idea is that God doesn't just sit back and wait for you to get it all together. He actively calls you right out of your mess with the full intention of turning that mess into your message.
And that divine call leads directly to the next step, justification. What's interesting here is how it's framed. Being made right with God isn't a prize you get for good behavior. It's what happens as a direct result of you simply answering His call.
And where does all of this lead? What's the final destination? Glorification. This is it. This is the full circle moment. The glory that was lost way back in the garden isn't just given back, it's fully realized. The journey ends exactly where it was always meant to.
And this right here is the sermon's incredible concluding promise. It wraps up the entire story we just walked through. A story that may have a messy middle, but it's a story that started in glory and is absolutely destined to end in glory.
So we end with this final question, because at the end of the day, that's the real challenge of this whole message. If you really believe your story is written to end in glory, how does that change the way you see the chapter you're living in right now? It's meant to change everything.